Today's scripture reading is James 3, 8 through 10. But no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse the multitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so.
Good morning. How are each and every one of you today? Did you have some stimulant in you so that you'll be able to stay awake during church? Possibly so. So, what do you think of the title of the sermon today? What is the tongue? Why are we given a tongue? Lots of reasons. Help keeps our teeth apart, right? Yeah. Yeah, all in the center. It's a taste sense, along with smell. It what? Helps you swallow. I find the tongue to be a difficult body element. This past week, I used my tongue inappropriately with my wife Dorothy. So I'm publicly acknowledging that I wasn't able to control my tongue this week. And you know what? It happened the week before, too. And probably, well, not the week before that because I was out of town. But if, like you have difficulty with your tongue, hopefully after today, you can listen in as I preach to myself, because I need this message as much as the next person. And the other thing that's confusing to me is, why don't our ears cause us problems? Or maybe our nose? It's the tongue that gets us into trouble so many times. So many times. How many of you have been to a school outing or maybe a church picnic where one of the activities was a balloon toss? Anybody? How do you do a balloon toss? Well, you have water balloons, right? Water balloons, and it's got to be in the summertime because balloon tosses in February in Iowa, not so good. So you start out with balloons and you have one row of people, kids usually, because adults don't do this anymore, kids on one side and kids on the other side, and you give a water balloon to each child, and they stand a little distance apart, and you say, go! And the person with the balloon does what? Tosses it to who? Person on the other side. Do they rear back and let them have it right in the side of the head? No, because the object of that game is to try not to break the water balloon. So they gently toss it, and the other person does the catching, so the water balloon doesn't break. And then they have to step one step apart further. And it goes back and forth, and the object of the game is to be the last person to have your balloon break. And then everybody gets wet, and it's all fun, and they have a good time, and they leave the balloon carcasses laying around. for the lawn people to pick up. Well, another instance with balloons, 121 years ago, when I was at Walla Walla College, in the springtime, when men's hearts would flutter back alive, they would think of, let's go on a date. So they'd find some unsuspecting woman, female, and they would invite them to go to church. And the first thing that comes to the man's idea is, I got to get my car cleaned. So next to the Sittner Hall, which is the boys' dormitory at Walla Walla University now, was a car wash. You could put 3 cars in there, and they'd have hoses and water spigots, and you could wash and sparkle the car all up. And then one of the places that you had to leave the dorm passed by the back of the dorm where there were speed bumps. You know what speed bumps are for, right? They're called sleeping policemen in Jamaica. The idea is to slow you down. And do you know college boys need to be slowed down sometimes? Yeah. So, out back of the dorm where the fire escapes were in the springtime after the cars were all washed, there'd be some people who didn't have cars. But they had water balloons. And it was especially enjoyable if the car that was passing over the speed bumps going slow behind the dormitory was a convertible. So you could lob a water balloon into a car or onto the roof or in the windshield after it had all been smoothed over and sparkly and dry and make a pretty good mess. And the people in the car, they couldn't tell who did it because there were 17 on this fire escape and 14 people on this fire escape, and they were all laughing, and the driver had no idea where the water balloon came from. Then there was a group of probably engineering students that devised a method of launching balloons. So they had big long rubber thingies, and they'd go up onto the roof of the dormitory, and they'd start launching these balloons half a block away and terrorized other students because just falling out of the sky came this awful thing. And sometimes it would hurt if you got hit in the wrong place. And then even they would borrow fire extinguishers that were just water type fire extinguishers. And if you filled those with water and went down to the gas station on the corner and you'd put 120 pounds of air pressure in the fire extinguisher full of water, and you'd have your buddy driving the car and you take the little hose from the fire extinguisher, and in those days cars had vent windows. Jason, where are you at? You know what a vent window is in the front car? Little windows that would open up, and so a person sitting in the passenger seat would have this hose up, and he'd have his arm, just like you did in the truck, hanging out the window, and that fire extinguisher hose right to his hand, and they were just sitting there walking, and they'd drive down College Avenue, where the rest of the people, especially the girls, were walking, and he'd have his left hand on the fire extinguisher handle. And as they'd go by, all of a sudden, out of nowhere came this deluge of water from the fire extinguisher. Excuse me. All over the unsuspecting pedestrian on the sidewalk. And then you'd end up emptying the fire extinguisher because there were a lot of people on the sidewalks. And then you have to go back to the gas station, get more water, get more air, and go back out. And pretty soon, they knew that car, and they would run to the hills when that car would come along. So, I said all that to say this, that water balloons are kind of small, yet they have the ability to cause delight, like at a picnic, or destruction, like off the dormitory roof. Did you hear something? No, the object was not to get caught. However, sometimes payback happened just out of the blue. You had no idea where it came from. So these balloons can cause joy or they can bring despair. And Proverbs 18:21 puts it this way, referring to the tongue, which is like a balloon. It's small. The tongue has the power of life and death. So you received in your bulletin today an insert that has some writing space on it, right? So if you have one of those, and if you're so inclined and you have a writing stick, you could write down a few of the ideas that we're going to talk about today. And we'll give you some practical steps. And I hope to put these to good use this coming week with my wife and my grandkids. The stakes are high. Your words can be either bring life or they can bring death to a spouse, your kids, your parents, your siblings, your relatives, your friends, your co-workers, and your neighbors. Our tongues can build others up or they can tear them down. Our little talk this morning is going to center on the book of James, and this short book has only 5 chapters in it, and it is known for its practical wisdom and common sense sound bites for life. Throughout the letter, James is helping his readers learn to view their trials from God's perspective and to resist the temptation as they bridle their anger. Because anger is usually involved with misuse of your tongue. Not so much your ear or your nose, okay? The church tolerating evil, showing favoritism, and were participating in fighting and slandering and lying about one another. That's why the book of James was written. They were using their tongues to destroy each other. Someone has said that great minds discuss ideas. Average minds discuss events. What do you suppose small minds discuss? People. That's right. The church that James is writing to was full of small-minded people who gossiped about each other and tore one another apart with their tongues. Could it be that we might be a bit like that church today? We're quick to avoid murder, stealing, and drunkenness, but we often assassinate others and leave destruction in our wake by the way we use our tongues. Husbands have stabbed their wives with words that were as sharp as daggers, and wives have lashed out with tongues that cut and pierce. Parents have devastated their children by repeated blasts of venom. Children have exploded at their parents with volleys that have leveled the family like a bomb. And churches have been wiped out by wagging tongues that have sliced, diced, and chopped people to shreds. Listen to what is written in James chapter 1, verses 19 and verse 26. Take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. If anyone considers himself religious and yet does not keep a tight rein on his tongue, he deceives himself and his religion as worthless. So if we can't control our tongue, it kind of cancels out what religious type of influence that we might have. If you and I launch into verbal balloons of destruction, they will have devastating consequences on others, and our words have a direct correlation with our own spirituality. If we don't exhibit control over tongues, we can render our religion of no value. James continues his treatment of the words that come out of our mouths by devoting almost all of chapter 3 to the topic. In verse 1, James warns people to be careful about their eagerness to be teachers, because teachers are held to a stricter judgment. Perhaps they were impressed with the authority and prestige of the office and forgot about the tremendous responsibility a teacher has to guard his or her words. Teachers are not the only one who are prone to sin with their tongues. In verse 2, we see that each of us need to admit that we all stumble, and in many ways, if anyone is never at fault in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to keep his whole body in check. If we are able to discipline our tongue, we can prove that we are a mature person. Or in other words, if you can't control your tongue, you are an immature person. I want you to notice how James connects sin of the tongue with sins of the body. He does this because our words usually lead to deeds. The hardest sins to control are the sins of the tongue. A mature person is able to hold the most uncontrollable part of his human anatomy in check. Proverbs 21 and verse 23 says, "He who guards his mouth and his tongue keeps himself from calamity." The tongue remains hidden for the most part. Not too many people walk around with their tongue sticking out so you can't see it. But when it does make its presence known, it has devastating power. The tongue can express or repress, can release or restrain. It can enlighten or obscure, abhor or adore, offend or befriend, affirm or alienate, build or belittle, comfort or criticize, delight or destroy, be sincere or sinister. The tongue can Xerox the good or X-ray the bad. In verses 3 through 12, James uses 6 different word pictures of the tongue to help us see how small yet powerful it is. Here's where you can write down these things in your little notes. He uses the example of a bit, like a horse bit, a rudder, a fire, a dangerous animal, a spring of water, or fruit. So let's explore each of these a little bit. The first metaphor is the bit that is put in a horse's mouth by a trainer. This relatively small piece of metal can control a very powerful animal, directing the horse to the right or left and telling him to stop. But the bit, when the bit is pulled back by the rider, it does what? Who knows horses? Where's the bit goes in the mouth, and what does it push on? Does it push on the tonsils? On the tongue? Where does it go in a horse's mouth? It goes between the back molars and the front incisors of the jaw of a horse. And in that position, when you pull on the reins, you can control the head of the horse, right or left, which indicates in a trained horse which way to go. And if you pull on the reins, it does what? With a trained horse, it encourages the horse to stop. Okay, James also compares the tongue to a rudder on a boat. Just as a small rudder can control the direction of a large liner or even an aircraft carrier, so too the tongue can control our lives. Both the bit and the rudder must overcome contrary forces. The bit controls the wild nature of a horse. The rudder must fight the winds and currents that would drive the ship off course. Both the bit and the rudder must be under the control of a strong hand. So there's another element involved with those two examples. After talking about the power of a bit in the mouth of the horse and the power of the small rudder to steer a large boat, James uses the image of fire, verses 5 and 6 of chapter 3. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by just a small spark. The tongue is also a fire, a word of evil among the parts of the body. It can corrupt the whole person, sets the whole course of his life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. So just like a small spark can ignite an entire forest, so too words that flow out of the tongues can corrupt lives and shipwreck families. Words that are unleashed without thought can significantly affect and alter lives. And I've found that even though you use certain words, if you continue to use those words, the person hearing them is thinking other things than what the words are actually saying. So a different message is communicated other than just the verbal words. James is pretty strong here as he tells us that our tongues are set on fire by hell itself. I had a friend named Pat Quigley. Does anyone know the Quigleys? A few people? The Quigleys used to live in a house down near Attica, Iowa. It was out in the country. It was on a small acreage, and it used to be a farm, and there was a barn there, but the barn was a long time gone. It was just the basement of the barn. And so the Quigleys would use that basement as the garbage and burn pit. So all year long they would go out and discard their refuse into this pit in kind of in the woods, but it was maybe 50 feet from the house. No big deal. But they would have an annual pit fire. And Dorothy and I got invited to this pit fire one year. Remember that, Dorothy? So, Pat Quigley had a brother, Kevin, and Kevin this year was assigned the task of lighting the fire in the pit to burn the garbage for the year. So, Pat thought the best thing to do to light this fire is to put 5 gallons of gasoline on it. It's a big pit, so he's out there pouring all this gasoline on the fire, and the fumes are starting to come out. And then he realized that for this gasoline to work, he needed to ignite it. So he stood back, maybe 10 feet and started throwing lit matches. Well, if you've ever thrown lit matches, Jack, what happens sometimes?
Never done that.
You just light the gas can on, then, right? Well, they go out. So eventually he figured out that if he got a little closer, he could strike that match, and while it was still flaming up, it would hit the trash in the fire. And it did. And there was this large eruption that occurred as the gasoline caught fire, and there was a big whoosh, and Pat kind of fell back a little bit, and then the fun stuff started happening because things started falling out of the sky. There were pieces of glass, There were pieces of wood and paper came fluttering down. It was a very impressive start of the fire, but it instantly became a bonfire, and their house, how far away did I say their house was? About 50 feet. Guess what it had for siding on it? Vinyl siding. You know what vinyl siding does when it's close to warmness? Kind of starts drooping. So the siding on the side of that house melted up, and I didn't go to any more of their garbage burning events. In fact, I didn't invite them to my house to do it either. But a single match into gasoline can create havoc and great damage. Parents and grandparents, if you want heaven's help in your home, you need to realize the potential of your words, the potential that your words have for destruction. Your words can bring a form of death to your kids or grandkids. We might not even realize what our words do to our children. When sparks fly in our homes, firestorms can erupt, creating a blazing inferno that can leave deep scars, lasting pain, and melted siding. How many of you have heard of Karen and Richard Carpenter? A few of us old guys do. The Carpenters were entertainers, and Karen Carpenter was the lead singer, and Richard would tickle the ivories. And they did a lot of performing. I think I went to one of their concerts one time before I met Dorothy. No, I don't remember her name that went with me. But Karen died of heart failure at the age of 32. And it was brought on by years of fighting an eating disorder. And it came out after her fatal obsession with her weight that it was triggered by a single reviewer's comment. When referring to Karen, this man called her Richard's chubby sister. While I'm sure there were other factors attributing to Karen Carpenter's struggles, this one comment released a flurry of self-doubt which led her to eventually die an early death from an eating disorder disease. She wanted to cut her weight. We really need to watch our words. Let me give you a suggestion when your child or your grandchild does something wrong. Instead of saying something like, "You're naughty," or "Don't be stupid," or "You're such a brat," why not say something like, what you did was wrong, and I don't want you to do it again. It's real easy to say things to our kids that are not really true. The tragedy is that they can very easily grow up thinking that they are naughty, or bratty, or stupid, or chubby, or ugly. Try to separate who they are from what they do. Other times we might be deliberately caustic as we look for ways to skewer someone with our words. Like launching a water balloon at some unsuspecting people, it can bring us strange pleasure to tear someone down. Maybe we think it helps us look better when we cut on others. Or maybe we think that they might learn a lesson and change if we just tell them enough times how to change. Do you remember the saying, "Sticks and bones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me"? Anybody? I'm not sure who came up with that, but it's not true, because words can break our hearts. Broken bones can heal with time, but a broken spirit caused by words of death is not quickly repaired. The wrong choice of words can spread like fire in our families. Let me ask you a couple of questions. How many of you have ever been maimed or killed with words? Are your kids dying a slow death because of your lethal lexicons? Is your tongue quick to criticize? Are you ragging on your kids and are not replenishing their love tanks every day? Do your words build up or do they tear down? It's important as it is to not speak death words and to instead speak words of life. Take a look at verses 7 and 8 in James 3. It says, all kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and creatures of the sea are being tamed and have been tamed by man, but no man can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. I have difficulty containing my tongue. How about you? It's interesting that humankind is the only creation that communicates with, has a tongue that can speak words. And thus we have the responsibility of control. It's amazing when you think about it. Every dangerous animal can eventually be tamed. Ferocious lions can jump through burning hoops. Grizzly bears can ride on horses. Huge elephants can do handstands. We have a remarkable ability to tame ferocious beasts, but can't get a hold of our own tongues. Like snake venom or corrosive rust, our tongues are just looking to strike unsuspecting people. They active, they never rest. There is no sting of a serpent that does as much damage as one wagging tongue. Verses 9 and 10 of James lay out a dichotomy and hypocritical nature of our tongues. With the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth came praise and cursing. My brothers, this should not be. We bless God while we blast away at others. There's something wrong with that picture. James now draws his fifth picture word to help us see that it would be impossible for us to both bless and blast out in the same mouth. He asks a penetrating question in verse 11. Can both fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? The image here is of a fresh flowing stream that has both bitter water and sweet water flowing through it. Natural springs still remain in the Middle East today. Some produce fresh water, some produce salt water. However, none produce both. It is impossible. James is saying here that just as it is impossible for a spring to have both sweet and sour water, so too is it inconceivable for the tongue to send forth both righteous and rumors, blessings and blasting, compliments and cursing. The final image that James uses is that of fruit. Verse 12, he says, my brothers, can a fig tree bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water. We expect a fig tree to have figs and a grapevine to have grapes. Nature produces after its own kind. James is calling us to be consistent. What comes out of our mouths is a reflection of what is in our hearts. So here's another tip for writing, if you're keeping track here, we're going to go through some action steps to help you in the struggle of controlling one's tongue. It's going to be 5 of these action steps this morning. So if you want to write 1 through 5, be ready. It's not enough to just hear about how powerful our tongues are, or even just to walk away understanding a bit more about this passage. If we want to have tamed tongues, then we must put into practice what we hear. So the first action step would be to spend time reading Proverbs and James. The book of Proverbs has 31 chapters, 1 for each day of the month. Why not make a decision to read a chapter each day along with a chapter from the book of James? After a month, you will have read through the entire book of Proverbs once and James 6 times. Almost every chapter in Proverbs has something to say about the tongue. Take Proverbs 11, verse 12. A man who lacks judgment derides his neighbors, but a man of understanding holds his tongue. Or Proverbs 12, verse 18. Reckless words pierce like a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. Okay, the second action step. Think first. A young mother asks her kids a question on a regular basis. Are your words flames or flowers? This helps her children realize that they have a choice to make. They can plant beautiful flowers with their words, or they can unleash a raging fire. To help with this step number 2, think of the acronym THINK. Try to ask these 5 questions before you speak. First of all, think. Is it true? T, true. Remember this rule about gossip. The more interesting it is, the more likely it is to be false. Do you speak the truth? The H in think. Is it helpful? Will your words help bring about a solution to a problem? The I in think. Is it inspiring? Will your words build up someone or tear them down? The N in think. Is it necessary? I hear that from my wife all the time. Is that really necessary? Well, to me it is sometimes. Do we have to say anything at all when you're thinking about? Is it necessary to say anything? And the K in think, is it kind? Are your words based on a desire to help? Okay, let's go back to these action steps now. We're on action step number 3. This one's pretty common, pretty plain. Talk less. Your chances of blowing it with your words are directly proportional to the amount of time you spend with your mouth open. Pretty common there. Abe Lincoln said, it's better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to do what? Open your mouth and remove all doubt. Calvin Coolidge said, I have never been hurt by anything I did not say. Go to Proverbs 20 and verse 19. It puts it this way, when words are many, sins are not absent, but he who holds his tongue is wise. There was a woman who had a very serious throat condition. The doctor told her that her vocal cords needed total rest. She was forbidden to talk for 6 months. Can you imagine doing that? The husband was going, yes! With a husband and 6 kids, this seemed impossible, but she did what she was told. When she needed the kids, she blew a whistle, Whenever she needed to communicate, she wrote things on pads of paper. After 6 months, her voice healed and came back. When asked what it was like to communicate only in writing, she said this: "You'd be surprised how many notes I crumpled up and threw in the trash before I gave them to anyone. Seeing my words before anyone heard them had an effect that I don't think I can ever forget." King David, after seeing how his words got him in trouble, wrote in Psalms 39, verse 1, "I will watch my ways and keep my tongue from sin. I will put a muzzle on my mouth." While you might not be able to stop talking for 6 months, we can learn to talk less by putting a muzzle on the muscles of our mouths. Okay, step number 4. Build up others. The Bible continuously reminds us to encourage one another with our words. Someone has said that we shouldn't complain about our spouse's faults, because if it weren't for those faults, they could have married someone much better than you. Are we speaking words of death or words of life? Words of life energize people. Proverbs 12, verse 25 says, "An anxious heart weighs a man down, but a kind word cheers him up." Chuck Swindoll, you've heard of him, tells a story about a guy who went to seminary with. This man had a bright red birthmark that covered half his face. After Chuck got to know him a little bit, he finally got up the courage to ask him what had happened. His friend answered by telling him what his dad had told him. "Son, that birthmark is where an angel kissed your face. You have it so that I can always pick you out in a crowd." Swindoll's friend then turned to him and said, "You know, I almost feel sorry for someone who doesn't have one of these." That dad spoke words of life to his son, and the son was still living off of those words years later. So let me challenge you to give you one encouraging word to everyone you talk to every day. It's a little hard, isn't it? You're working with grandkids, you want them to help you hang sheetrock, and you drop a box of screws all over the floor. One kind word. You'll probably have to be deliberate. Tell your son or daughter or grandkids something that will build them up. Teenagers, give a life word to your parents. Siblings, say something kind to each other. Couples, affirm and encourage each other at least once a day. A hug in the morning. A good night. Okay, the 5th action step, number 5. Have heart surgery. I don't mean go under the knife. Why is it so hard to say things, kind things, with our tongues? It's because the Bible says that in our strength, we will never tame our tongues. In our own strength. Well, then whose strength would it be? Where does all that garbage come from that comes out of our mouth? Jesus gives us some insight in Matthew 12:34 and in 15:19. For out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. Out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, lies, and slander. God doesn't want you to leave this service today and try to tame your tongue totally in your own strength. Ain't going to happen. It will take more than just willpower and determination. In its natural state, the tongue is a restless evil. It's like a ferocious beast that will not be subdued, and like a serpent that's full of deadly poison. When I was much younger, I had a very foul mouth, and it took time for the Lord to clean up my language. I couldn't just automatically stop by forcing myself. I needed to have a new heart and a new outlook. If you want to stop using death words and begin speaking words of life, you need a different heart. The good news is that Jesus specializes in heart transplants. Friends, if you're never allowed Jesus to change you from the inside out, then it's time for some heart surgery. If you keep your old heart, you'll continue to launch verbal grenades and live like you've always lived. But if you ask Jesus for a new one, by turning your life over to Him, you can have a fresh start and a new beginning. Only God can give us the power we need to build others up instead of tearing them down. If you want to be a dispenser of life words instead of death words, you need to be rightly related to God. And we become rightly related to God through our words. Romans 10:9 and 10 says, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you confess and are saved. So in closing, I'd like to include a little story. I shook my head in disbelief. This couldn't be the right place. After all, I couldn't possibly be welcome here. I had been given an invitation several times by several different people, and had finally decided to see what this place was all about. Yes, I was at the right place. I checked. I peered through the window again and saw a room full of people whose faces seemed to glow with joy. All were neatly dressed, adorned in fine garments, and appeared strangely clean as they dined at this exquisite restaurant. You're probably thinking about food right now. Ashamed, I looked down at my own tattered and torn clothing, covered in stains. I was dirty. In fact, filthy. A foul smell seemed to consume me, and I couldn't shake the grime that clung to my body. As I turned around to leave, the words from the invitation seemed to leap out at me. Come as you are. No jacket required. I decided to give it a shot. Mustering up every bit of courage I could find, I opened the door to the restaurant and walked up to the man standing behind the podium. Your name, sir? He asked me with a smile. Jimmy D. Brown. I mumbled without looking up. Oh, so it was Jimmy D. Brown. I thrust my hands into my pockets, hoping to conceal their stains. He didn't seem to notice the filth that I was covered in, and he continued, Very good, sir. A table is reserved in your name. Would you like to be seated? I couldn't believe what I heard. A grin broke out on my face, and I said, Yes, of course. He led me to a table, and sure enough, there was a placard with my name written on it in deep, dark red. The man returned and said, I recommend the special of the day. With it, you are entitled to heaping portions of everything on this menu. You've got to be kidding, I thought to myself. You mean I can have all of this? What is the special of the day? I asked with excited ringing in my voice. Salvation, was his reply. I'll take it, I practically cried out. Then, as quickly as I made that statement, the joy left my body. A sick, painful ache jerked through my stomach and tears filled my eyes. Between my sobs, I said, "Mister, look at me. I'm dirty and nasty. I have a foul mouth. I'm unclean and unworthy of such things. I'd love to have all of this, but I just can't afford it." Undaunted, the man smiled again. "Sir, your check has already been taken care of, and that by that gentleman over there," he said, pointing to the front of the room. "His name is Jesus." Turning, I saw a man whose very presence seemed to light the room. It was almost too much to look at. I found myself walking towards him, and in a shaking voice I whispered, "Sir, I'll wash the dishes or sweep the floors or take out the trash. I'll clean myself up and stop swearing. I'll do anything I can to repay you for all of this." He opened his arms and said with a smile, "Son, all of this is yours if you just come unto me. Ask me to clean you up, and I will. Ask me to take away the stains, and it is done. Ask me to clean up your mouth, and I will. All you have to do is accept the gift." Astonished, I fell at his feet and said, "Please, Jesus, please clean up my life." Immediately I heard the words, "It is finished." I looked down, and white robes adorned my squeaky clean body. Something strange and wonderful had just happened. I felt new, like a weight had been lifted off. And I found myself seated at his table. The special of the day had been served. The Lord said to me, "Salvation is yours."